His legacy and his work for social justice continues today at the Thelton Henderson Center for Social Justice at Berkeley Law. And I would be remiss if I did not note a most recent accolade that you received, Judge Henderson, in August of 2020, when you received the George H.W. Bush Distinguished Alumnus Award from the National College Baseball Hall of Fame for your baseball achievements at Cal, which you started after your football years. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Judge Alsup, who is another member of our panel, is referred to by many individuals as a Renaissance man. Born in Mississippi with a natural talent for learning how things work, he began as an engineering major, but the moral force of the March in Washington in 1963 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 spurred his interests into a different path that led him to Harvard Law School and eventually to a clerkship for Justice William O. Douglas on the United States Supreme Court. He served as an assistant to the United States Solicitor General and in the United States Justice Department before his nomination to the bench in 1999. He has drawn attention for his unique cases deciding technology and programming applications, which include Oracle versus Google and Waymo versus Uber. He has used his own understanding of technical processes in coding and photography to improve the quality of the cases and to open the technical aspects to public understanding. He has also been the presiding judge over a number of cases with civil rights at issue, including preventing the rescission of DACA and finding that the government's no-fly policy did not supply sufficient due process. He continues to preside over the PG&E felony probation matter, where he has continuously put public safety over shareholder dividends. Judge Alsup has a strong faith in the jury system and believes that establishing a sense of fairness is the key to winning a trial. He encourages law firms to have their young attorneys, especially women attorneys, argue motions in his courtroom. It's something that several judges on our bench have also followed in that practice. In addition to his beautiful photographs of Yosemite and the Sierra Nevada mountains, which grace the attorney conference rooms in our 3 courthouses, in 2019, Judge also wrote a memoir entitled One Over, Reflections of a Federal Judge on his journey from Jim Crow, Mississippi, that examined what it was like to grow up white in Mississippi to parents who believed in segregation at a time when the civil rights movement was exploding in the 1950s and 1960s. Our final panelist, Judge Oreck, is a native San Franciscan with a family history of public legal service. His father served for many years on our bench. Judge Oreck's long career working on civil rights issues and with low-income members of our society began when he started volunteering at a local community outreach center when he was only 13 years old. At Boston College of Law, he operated a legal services office, and after graduation, he worked at the Georgia Legal Services Program in Savannah, serving the low-income community there from 1979 to 1984. After being in private practice, Judge Oreck joined the Civil Division of the United States Department of Justice as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General, and eventually headed the Office of Immigration Litigation in the Obama administration. He was confirmed by the Senate to our federal bench in 2013. Judge Oreck has inherited Judge Henderson's role of overseeing the reforms of the Oakland Police Department and has not hesitated to criticize the slow pace of reforms as it appointed independent investigations of shootings by Oakland police. He ruled that former President Trump's executive order withholding federal funding from sanctuary cities that limited cooperation with ICE was unconstitutional. Judge Oreck is very involved in the alternative courts in our courthouse in San Francisco and hopes to see them increase in the coming new administration. Judge Oreck's personal mantra is do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly. And I think that aptly describes him. It's a pleasure to have as our moderator today, Laura Hurtado. Laura graduated from Yale University and attended Stanford University School of Law. She was a law clerk for Judge Alsup from 2011 to 2012 and is now a partner at Pillsbury. It's a pleasure to now turn this program over to Laura. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy Sue. It's a pleasure to be here and to moderate this program with our fantastic panel of judges. So to kick it off, as a reminder to everyone, the title of the program today is The Civil Rights Movement, Lessons Learned and Reflections for the Future. So with that in mind, judges, can each of you take a couple of minutes to share with us a memory of something you were doing back then, just to give us a little bit of insight into your past and to set the stage for the remainder of our discussion? So if we can start with Judge Henderson, that would be great.
What I was doing back then, I was working for the Civil Rights Division. And as Randy Sue mentioned, I was the first Black to become a member of the Black attorney to work out in the field for the Civil Rights Division. And at that time, there were only 37 attorneys. Judge Orrick can tell us later on how many attorneys were in the division when he was there, but there were only 37 in 1962. And President Kennedy and Attorney General Bobby Kennedy determined that the best way to use those meager resources was to focus on voting rights in the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. So that's what I was doing. I was on the Louisiana team, and I would go out, we would try to find a pattern and practice of discrimination. And I was just one of the 37 attorneys. My life changed as a member of the department pretty dramatically when one day when I was working in Shreveport, I got a call asking me to drive over to Birmingham, where there was a lot of action, and Reverend King was just getting started on a movement there, and Bull Connor was just getting started trying to down that movement. And I was asked to go over and observe and to report back on what was happening and the dynamics and what might happen in the future. And I think it was that trip when I got over there and I was able to get information from the civil rights people there, the SNCC people, the CORE people, and King's people that seemed like the other attorneys in the department hadn't been able to get. And so it was my great fortune at that moment to no longer be a member of the voting rights team in Louisiana, but a guy that sort of followed the movement. Wherever there was action, that's sort of where I flew in. So that's a short circuit of what I did until I got sloppy with my lending of cars that might come up later on.
Thank you, and I hope that you do share that story later on in the panel. Judge Alsup, what about you?
My favorite memory from that era was 1966. I was a senior in college at Mississippi State University. Now, when Judge Henderson was over in Birmingham, I was in high school, so I'm a few years behind in the chronology. But in '66, I was a senior in Mississippi State, at Mississippi State. And the thing that I'm proudest of looking back on that era was my role in bringing the first African-American ever in Mississippi to give a speech on what had been traditionally an all-white campus. Prior to that time, Mississippi had regulations that were used in a way to prohibit anyone but a white person giving a speech. And we wanted to bring, my roommate and I, were probably the two most active students on campus. We wanted to bring Aaron Henry to speak. Aaron Henry was the state president of the NAACP. Of course, he was African American, and the school turned it down. We had to get their permission. They said no, and that went to the board of trustees, and they said no as well. So we organized a protest on the campus, but that didn't really do any good. What did some good was Danny, my roommate, and I decided that we would join in a lawsuit. The two of us would be the plaintiffs to sue the state of Mississippi to allow us to be able to invite Aaron Henry to speak. And I happened to write a letter explaining to the president of the university why that was important and why I was going to do that. And that letter was then shown to the board of trustees, and they backed down. And Aaron Henry in January of '67 did come, and he was very well received. It was an all-white audience, 1,500 people, and he gave a speech on the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which at that time was fresh on the books. And by the way, had been enacted in part based on information that Judge Henderson developed in 62, 63, and 62 and 63 that was sent to Congress and helped to pass the Voting Rights Act of 65. But in 67, it was fresh on the books, and Aaron Henry gave that speech. It was a great moment for the First Amendment, and that's what I look back on with some pride. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. And Judge Oreck, what's the memory that you can share with us?
Well, when I went down to Georgia in 1979, as I was driving south, I realized when I crossed the Mason-Dixon line, I didn't know anybody who was in the South at all. So I went down to Georgia. I worked out of the Savannah office of Georgia Legal Services. And my job was in part to represent people who came into our office in Savannah. And then once a week, I'd drive out to the rural counties and I'd interview people at the welfare office. And there was Friday court. The judges also were circuit riding as we were. And so I was representing people with their individual legal problems. And then we also brought impact litigation in federal court. There was one pretty conservative Democratic judge appointed by President Carter who was sitting down there. And I brought a number of cases in front of him. The incident that I'll tell you about is when I first got down there, there had been a group of 3 people who'd been coming to the office with a problem, and nobody could figure out how to deal with it. So they dumped it on me. So I met with Mrs. Haygood and 2 other people from a community organization in Garden City. And their problem was that there was an industrial development that was going to go into their neighborhood because their neighborhood had been zoned commercial in the late 50s. And they didn't know about it. And they thought it was unfair that a commercial development an industrial development would come and ruin their neighborhood. So we looked at it, and I went down to the Planning Commission. I got the papers and we looked at it, and legally it looked like a problem, but we kept working it. And so we decided to go down to the Planning Commission, got on the public hearing at the end of the day and laid out the problem. And they said, well, you can file an objection. So I went back the next time, filed an objection. This time, instead of 3 African Americans, there were about 6 who came down. And we had several hearings. At the last hearing, where the argument was there was no notice given to a historically African American community, which had no paved roads, no sewage, but and a couple of houses with bricks on them, but not a very fancy neighborhood by any stretch, but they didn't have notice of this change that was going to ruin the rest of their community. The final hearing, we went down, we packed the joint. We had people standing in the aisles all around this planning commission, and the planning commissioners reversed their planning director's recommendation to have to rezone this neighborhood. It was, or to put in the industrial development, they rezoned it residential. And the planning director quit on the spot. He was sputtering angry with what we had done. And within a year and a half, the city had gotten Model Cities money to pave all the streets, put sewage in, put street lights down there, and that community has thrived. And if anybody was paying attention, the last speech that was given before the special election by Kamala Harris was down in Garden City.
Thank you. Well, it's fascinating to hear that all three of you were down south doing important civil rights work and then ended up here in California in our district, where we're so fortunate to have you as judges. And so hopefully we'll hear a little bit about how you made the transition from the South to California throughout the course of the program. But why don't we jump into the first topic? So each of you, as we've heard, has participated in, been witness to, or somehow been shaped by the civil rights movement. And Judge Henderson, you wrote a foreword to Judge Alsup's memoir, Won Over. And in that foreword, you said that you and Judge Alsup were, quote, both fighting battles in the same war for equal rights. Me, a Black government lawyer, born in Louisiana, but raised in California from the outside. Bill, a white Mississippian from the inside, end quote. And Judge Oreck, you're a native San Franciscan, as we've learned, and in law school, you served as a student attorney in the Boston College Legal Assistance Bureau, and after receiving your law degree, went to Savannah, like you were just speaking about, to work for the Georgia Legal Services Program. So everyone comes of age and develops a sense of morality and political consciousness in their own way and in their own time. What sparked that moment for you?
Go ahead, Thelton.
Okay. Well, I think one of the most dramatic moments in my life that made me a different person, a better person, I think, was when I was in Birmingham. There were a lot of things that happened before then, but the thing I think that most appropriately responds to your question, I was in Birmingham, and it was a time when Dr. King's movement was struggling. He had not had a successful crusade in South Carolina, I believe it was, and he was coming to Birmingham, and they had essentially run out of adults to demonstrate, and that what his power was to get people out to protest and get arrested and get abused so that the country could see it and eat at the conscience of the country. And they didn't have enough adults to do it. So he recruited a fellow named James Bevells to recruit children. Let's do it with what they came to call the Children's Crusade. And as I was there on this big day when the children came, and I'll just never forget it, the kids came, they were many of them were from the rural parts of the area, and they came in overalls. Some of them came in bare feet. And I think what touched me most of all was that many of them came with a modest little face towel wrapped around their toothbrush and toothpaste because they expected to go to jail. And they were ready to go to jail, these little kids. And I have never forgotten it. It touched me, the bravery, their willingness as young kids. We're talking about kids that seemed to be as young as 13 and on up into the teens, coming out to fight for their freedom and for their justice and to join Dr. King's crusade. And I've never forgotten that bravery. When I think there's something tough to do and I look back on that, I think I'm better able to face it up. So that is just a very, very important moment in my life, seeing that and having that memory.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what about you, Judge Alsup?
1963, and exactly the time period that Judge Henderson's referring to was, I would say, the year that had the greatest influence on my own thinking. As you said earlier, my mom and dad believed in segregation. They weren't rabid about it, but they did believe in segregation. And so I grew up not thinking critically about anything that was going on around us until the civil rights movement started. And that put it on the front page often, but it wasn't always on the front page. And Birmingham in 1963 in the spring was when it became a national issue and one that you just could not ignore anymore. And those children, the water hoses, the cattle prods that the police were using in Birmingham against people who were just protesting peacefully. By the way, that was one of the marvelous things about Dr. King, was that he kept everything peaceful. There was no violence by the protesters. They wanted to march for better conditions, better rights. They never tore up anything. They didn't bust up the storefronts. It was a completely peaceful protest, and yet the Birmingham police and Bull Connor came out with cattle prods, these fire hoses that were lethal. And so those images I can remember today and how I reacted to it. That was awful. And I didn't want to be associated with the people who were doing those awful things to the protesters. Fast forward just a few months to September of 1963. And by that point, I had started my first year at Mississippi State. And we opened up the paper one morning, and there was the picture of the 16th Street Baptist Church blown up, a part of it blown up, and those little children had been killed. That was a turning point for America. It was also a part of the turning point for me, but that 1963 stands out for me as a year which caused me to reflect on what was the right thing, what was right and just in America, and fair and decent. Just, my mom and dad may have been segregationists, but they taught us fairness and decency. And what we were seeing was not fair and was not decent. So how could you resolve that contradiction? That was the year that I began to reflect mightily on that question.
It's interesting that both you and Judge Henderson speak about the children, and I wonder if it was in part the vulnerability of that population that made it so impactful for the both of you.
Certainly for me it was, and just as Judge Henderson described it, doing that to children there's no excuse. It was a Ku Klux Klan that planted those bombs in that church and killed those children, and just unthinkable to my mind.
Yeah, same with me. Yeah, it really touched me, and the vulnerability and the innocence of them, I don't think they fully realized the implications of what they were doing, what they might be getting into, but they're willing to do it just on faith. And it just, as I said, it was just very touching, just very lastingly so.
And Judge Orrick, how about for you? What was a moment for you that kind of sparked the development of your political consciousness?
Well, so I think 1968, actually, the assassination of Dr. King and the assassination of Robert Kennedy were sort of defining moments. I was in 9th grade, and my dad had been a very good friend of Robert Kennedy's, and I idolized him. And what my father believed and what Robert Kennedy used to say is one person can make a difference and every person should try. So I went, that summer I went to work at the Potrero Hill neighborhood house. And in those days, the Potrero Hill was half African-American, many of them living in the projects on the backside of the hill, and half in a sort of lower middle class kids of cops and people who were working in town. And I worked there for the summer, take the bus across town. We'd take the kids wherever we could take them, often to Golden Gate Park or other places. And I did that for 3 years. And I learned a lot. And then I went to work for an Upward Bound program for 4 years with kids who were high risk but high need, of all sorts of ethnic backgrounds and abilities. And then I started working with legal services related things. So it was the sum of those experiences that headed me down to Georgia. But the real moment that made me think that I had to do something were the assassinations of Dr. King and Robert Kennedy.
Thank you for sharing those stories. So why don't we turn to our second topic, which is really about those who have mentored you. So we all stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, and each of you is a mentor to a number of us in the practice and others. So I'm curious to hear about who were your mentors, both professionally and personally, and what impact did they have on you?
I seem to be the one who starts these.
You're the leader.
Not at all. But you know, you mentioned the term standing on shoulders that preceded me, and there, in that regard, there were many people whose shoulders I stand upon. Thurgood Marshall is one, and many people, and clearly I stand on Dr. King's shoulders and Medgar Evers' shoulders, whom I met and who were so brave. I'm convinced, having gotten to know them well enough, that they knew that they were risking their life every day they walked out of their house, and it didn't deter them. And this being the end of Black History Month, I always wait for Black History Month because they show that newsreel of Dr. King on the pulpit talking about getting to the promised land. And he says, "I may not get there with you." And that's what he was talking about. I think he knew he wasn't going to get to the promised land with them, but he was not going to give up the fight. So certainly I stand on those shoulders and others that I won't try to go into. But, you know, it's interesting. This is Black History Month, and we're talking about Black heroes, but one that I need to acknowledge that I stood on his shoulders and was my mentor in a most personal way and inspired me was John Doerr. He was my boss at the Civil Rights Division and one of the greatest men I've ever met. Generally You might touch on this, Bill, because you worked later, but bosses I've had in a lot of jobs like this, you know, they ran it, they supervised it, they went home at 5:30 and had dinner and made sure you did your work. John was there every night that we were there. We were 37 proud young civil rights attorneys that we were going to change the voting system all by ourselves. And we were proud of who would work the latest, and we'd have late meals together and then go back to the office and work to outdo each other. And he was there all the way, but he was out in the field, and I still carry some of his wisdom. One hot day in one of the parishes in Louisiana, it was a blistering humid day. We were going to various houses to interview people to be witnesses in the suit, and I was weltering. And John's take on it, which I still carry with me, instead of hanging it up and going in, he told this little story. He said, you know, Thelton, the best salesman, the most successful salesman are the ones at the end of a day like this, they decide to ring one more doorbell. And John always rang one more doorbell, and I always have tried to ring one more doorbell. And so I stand firmly on his shoulders. A lot of what I believe in, a lot of what I try to do, I learned from John. And it was John, when I was fired from the Justice Department, who supported me, made me feel worthy, made me feel that I hadn't done a bad thing, and remained my friend and my supporter and my inspirer till the end of his life, which died just a few years ago. So he's a very special man in my life. And one other thing that he did that I can never thank him enough for, could never thank him enough for, when I came up for a judgeship at Marilyn Patel, whom all of you know, and I were up for the two open judgeships that came. And I got a call from someone from the committee late that night telling me, okay, they just decided, and it's you and Marilyn Patel. I went to bed happy that night. I got up the next morning, and the newspaper said Marilyn Patel appointed a judge, and my name wasn't in there. And then I got a call from Alan Cranston's office saying, Mr. Cranston would like to see you at his office this afternoon. And I had the entire day to think, what's going on here? You know, why isn't my name there? What's happened? And I finally thought, I said, the only thing I can think of, you know, they can't really know about that Milky Way that I stole when I was 8 years old at the corner store, though it couldn't be that. It had to be the car. And so I called John Doerr, and he was in a deposition in Texas. He was practicing law at that point with his own firm. And I said, something's going on, and I think it's the car. Would you mind calling Senator Cranston just in case that's what's going on here? And he did. And so when I went to that meeting at Senator Cranston's office, again, I can never forget it. I was sitting there, and his aide was talking to me, and I'd never been in this situation. They had the two long couches sort of put together so that it made a sort of a V or an L, and I was sitting in the middle. And I realized I was being cross-examined because they were sitting on the ends of the couches, and I could never look at them and see them both at the same time. And I know that was what that was designed to do. And it was a very long, excruciating time. But at the end of it, I'll never forget this. Alan Cranston said, well, Thelton, I think he said, I don't think it was Mr. Henderson. Yes, Thelton, you're going to be our next federal judge. I got a call from John Doerr this afternoon, and he told me that if I didn't appoint you to this position, it would show how little I understood the civil rights movement. And I don't respect, there's no man I respect more than John Doerr. And so again, this is what John Doerr, I think, whatever Cranston was going to do, he did the right thing by me, and I owe that to John too. So anyway, that's the man whose shoulders I stand on.
Thank you, Judge Henderson.
Laura,
Yeah.
would this be a good time for Judge Henderson to tell the story about the car?
I think so. I think so. So we don't leave our audience hanging, wondering what the car story is about.
Oh, well, it's fresh in my mind because at 7 tonight, I'm giving another one of these panels for the Santa Clara NAACP, and they've asked me to tell the story, so I'll warm up by telling it here. As I said, I got to know Dr. King quite well. There was only one place we could stay in Birmingham that blacks could stay. That was the A.G. Gaston Motel. So we both found ourselves there, very often right down the hall from each other. Anyway, on one fine day, I had been out in the field working on a voting rights case, interviewing witnesses for an upcoming trial. And at the end of the day, I came back to the hotel, the motel. It was a A.G. Gaston Motel. And just as I was driving into the parking lot, Dr. King was being driven out by a local minister named Vernon Smith. And we stopped. I'm heading in, he's heading out. We stopped there in the driveway and began to talk. I can't remember now what we talked about, but at the end of the talk, Reverend Smith said, Mr. Henderson or Thelton, you know, I'm worried about my bad tire, my rear tire on this car. You know, I'm a little bit worried about it. Are you going to use your car tonight? And I said, nope, I'm checking in for the day. I'm going to go in and eat and go to bed. He said, can we borrow it? And I said, sure, you can. Well, it happened to be a rent-a-car that was paid for by my government credit card. And also, back in those days, those naive days, we didn't know that Dr. King didn't know, but he was being followed, surveilled very closely by the FBI and by state agencies. And so we drove back into the parking lot. I got out and I gave Reverend Smith my keys, and they drove off to Selma. And for those of you who have seen the movie Selma, which was a very fine movie, some of the scenes there of Dr. King preaching, he was driving off that night. I loaned him the car to one of those meetings that you saw in Selma, and he was being followed. And what they usually did when they followed the cars that Dr. King was in that were owned by locals, they would take the license plate, and when Dr. King left town to go on to wherever else he was going, the locals that had accommodated him with their car or not got punished in some way. They'd lose their job, they would trace the license, lose their job, or a cross would be burned on their lawn or something. But here they sort of struck gold when they got this license plate because it was rented to a government lawyer. And the paper the next day, I'll never forget this, and I've never been more highly titled or described in any article that's ever been written about me. The next day, the Birmingham paper described me as a high-ranking government official and intimate friend of President John F. Kennedy. And here I'm just out of law school. But anyway, and it became a very political thing. And they used it to try to show that the Kennedy administration was secretly supporting the civil rights movement. There's nothing worse that you can tell a Southerner that something like that. And so it was a very highly political thing, and I lost my job as a result of it. And it was one of the low points of my life, but now one of the great memories of my life, because I survived it, and some wonderful things happened to me after that, and some wonderful people who helped me get through that period. So that's the story in a nutshell.
Thank you for sharing that. So Judge Alsup, let's hear about you in terms of your mentors.
Well, like Judge Henderson, I've been fortunate to have a number of mentors and people who've pointed me in the right direction. I want to focus on one who may seem obscure. No one in our audience has ever heard of this person, but he had quite an influence on me at the time. At Mississippi State, I was very active in the YMCA, which was the only student YMCA, which had a big building right there in the middle of the campus. And we had a minister who was a faculty member, and the one that year was Reverend Kermit Clardy, C-L-A-R-D-Y, young guy, early 20s, maybe 25 at most, United Methodist minister from Emory, and he came to Mississippi to be the faculty advisor for the students at the student YMCA program. I only actually lived in the Y, as well as wound up being the president of the student Y. So I had a lot to do with him, Reverend Clardy. I'll give you just one example of how he guided us. He used the Socratic method and really opened my eyes to the proposition that it's not enough just to be of goodwill, but that you needed to act on your goodwill. And that was one proposition that he taught us and taught me. Also, he arranged for me to take a trip to Chicago to a student meeting in the summer of 1966. And because of that, it was my first commercial air flight. I was, a young kid. And I was there for a week, and the organizers of the student conference, one of them asked me if I wanted to go down and hear Dr. King speak. At that time, he was very active in Chicago in the housing marches, Cicero, Gage Park, some names people might remember. And so we went, I said, yeah, I'd like to do that. I had tried to see him speak in the past, but I never succeeded. So I went with him and one other guy, and we three of us went down to the, I believe it was the Liberty Baptist Church in the south side of Chicago on the Elevated. And to make a very memorable evening a little shorter, we sat in 1,000 people easily in this large, beautiful church. Probably 10 other people were white, and 3 of us were white, and everyone else was African American. And we felt very welcomed, by the way. There was nothing nothing negative at all about that. There was first a warm-up speaker. I can't remember his name right now. It's in my memoir, though. But then around 10 o'clock, with no introduction, came Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King, to the pulpit. And it was an amazing memory for me. That audience of 1,000 people was as quiet as could be, very respectful. He was completely admired by the crowd, and they wanted to hear every word he had to say. He began very slowly, and not the kind of fiery speeches that you see on TV and that Thelton was referring to, but he started out reporting on his negotiations that day with Mayor Daley. They were having negotiations every single day. And it was a wonderful event because he was sharing as if it were the committee of the whole. He was sharing what had happened and what the strategy was, and wanted everyone in that room to feel as if they were part of those negotiations with Mayor Daley. And then he said, we're going to have a march tomorrow. That was the church where they were organizing each day. The days that there were marches, they weren't marches every day. And then he lapsed into that pulpit cadence that we remember so well. And it was, justice is on our side. God is on our side. And keep the faith. And through it all, the congregation was just as quiet and respectful. And anyway, that because of Kermit Clardy and his trying to make me a small-time leader at Mississippi State on our campus, and because he thought it would be good for me to have that exposure to go to Chicago, he had to pull some strings because Mississippi State had pulled out of the national organization over segregation. So I had to go as a Southern area delegate and not as a representative from Mississippi State, because Mississippi State wasn't even a member anymore because of the state had made us withdraw. So it was he pointed me in the right direction and gave me a lot of guidance. It was over about an 18-month period. And so he went on to Vietnam and other things and still is alive and well in South Carolina. I speak with him every now and then and thank him for the guidance that he gave me back then. So that's my mentor.
Thank you, Judge. Well, I hope you invited him to join our program today.
By the time I did not, I'm sorry. By the time I got the link, they were not accepting any more signups. So I did not do that. So
well,
Kermit's
okay.
not online, and I'm embarrassed to admit that, but that's true.
Well, that's okay because we're recording it, so you'll be able to send him the recording.
I will do that. We'll do that.
So Judge Orrick, I want to ask you the same question about your mentors and the impact that they had on you. But before that, I want to ask you if that's Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the coffee mug that you've been drinking from.
No, it's not. Actually, I have two coffee mugs that are similar. One contains a number of Democratic pictures of Democrats, and one, and so from John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Eleanor Roosevelt, so on and so forth. Barack Obama got on here. And the other one contains a bunch of Republicans. And, it has Newt Gingrich and a lot of people. So I often ask people who ask that question, whether once they look at who was portrayed, what they think the political party of the artist was. But I will not ask that question here. And before I get to the mentors, John Doerr was, among other things, he was at the Justice Department when my dad was, but historically, he said one of the great things during the Civil Rights Movement, he was in the middle, and Thelton, you may remember, this may have been with the Freedom Riders or somebody else, but he got in the middle of a crowd down south, very angry. What was it?
I was there. It was following Medgar Evers' funeral. Yeah.
And he said, "My name is John Doerr and I stand for justice."
Exactly.
And then he got whacked, as I recall the story. But so my mentors, I like judges Alsup and Henderson. I've had many mentors. I've been very lucky in my life. But I would have to start with my father, who was a courageous, idealistic, optimistic human being, can do, he exuded the spirit of the new frontier, and was he was a great role model and friend. And I'd like to say he pushed me into the work that I did in Georgia, except for he didn't. He, in fact, didn't want me to go to Georgia. He sat me down after I got this job that I was very proud of, and I was about to head off, and he said, "You know, Billy, someday you're going to have to get a real job." But besides that, he was a great supporter of mine also, and so I would start with him, and I'll just mention two others. One was the head of the Upward Bound program that I worked in for 4 or 5 years, a guy named Frank White. He was also a teacher of mine in high school, and he burned with passion and idealism and in support of equal rights for everybody. And today, whenever I'm facing a tough decision, ethically or in any other way, I always think, what would Frank do? That's what I think. And then the final person was the lawyer. When I went down to Georgia Legal Services, there was this brilliant lawyer named Rose Firestein, who was strategic, best lawyer I ever met. And she told me that if I really wanted to make change, I should be thinking about suing the bastards and taking their houses.
If I
Well,
could
thank you. Yes.
for just a minute, speaking of your father, Bill, I just have to tell this story. He was also one of my mentors and just embraced me when I came on the court and made me feel welcome, would come down that hall, that journey all the way down the other end of the hall, and walk into my office and slam his hand on the desk and just say, "Thelton, you know what? We've got the best job in the world." He'd say that every time, and I would agree with him. But I'm the only one that can tell this story because I'm 87. And when I was chief judge, your father reached his 80th birthday. And everybody said, we have to have something for Bill for his 80th birthday. And I sort of finagled him, and you don't finagle him easy, but to let us give him a party. And we got a fine restaurant that we went to. I don't remember which one, in San Francisco. And everybody gave little speeches and, told him how great he was, and he was. And the reason 80 is important, finally I said, "Okay, Bill, you've got to respond to this. You've got to say something." And I'll never forget it because a number of years later, I used this very line at my 80th birthday party. He got up and he looked around and he said, and I try to capture his voice, "You know the best thing about turning 80? And he looked for a while and then he said, "Nothing, absolutely nothing." And that was his entire speech. I will never forget. He was a wonderful man. I had to tell that story, and I'm sorry, Laura.
That's a good one.
Throw us off, but
No, that was a wonderful story. I'm glad that you shared it. So we're going to fast forward a little bit by a few decades, but before that, I just want to remind everyone in the audience, if you have a question that you would like to be asked, you can send it by email, and the email address is in the chat box, but I'll also read it out right now. It's ndca.fba@gmail.com. So feel free to send questions and we can ask them of the judges. So fast forwarding now a little bit, in 2008, we elected Barack Obama as the first African-American president of the United States. He was elected to a second term as president, and his second swearing in took place on Martin Luther King Jr. Day in 2013. What are your reflections on that moment in history and its meaning for our country? And did you think that you would live to see a Black president of the United States in your lifetime?
Okay, taking the lead again. To your last question, no, I repeatedly said when he was running the first time, in all my wisdom, I said, America's not ready for a Black president. I didn't expect him to be running. I thought it was sort of preliminary. It might lead the way for later time when someone would really run and really win it, but I didn't think it was time yet. And I was so astounded when it did happen. And I took great heart with that. And again, one of those great moments that we remember in our lives was after the election, they have this sort of victory party or whatever they have when Barack and Michelle got out on the floor and like they really cared and danced after the victory. And I remember crying when I saw that. It was just so very special. You know, I think at that moment in my life, I really believe that we had crossed that threshold, you know, a racial threshold when that happened, and signaled that we had passed the final big hurdle, and we were going to go on to better things. Recent events, of course, have shown otherwise, but such a special moment, and I think he handled himself in such a classy way, and that, you know, I think of him as my Jackie Robinson. It took a Jackie Robinson with that temperament and that ability to say, yes, we can play baseball as good as you can, and we can act in a way that's acceptable to you. And I think that's what Barack Obama did, and it was a very important moment, a very important chapter in our history. But as again, with subsequent events, we've got a ways to go before we really get there.
Mm-hmm. And what about you, Judge Alsup?
My view at the time was pretty much what Judge Henderson said, with maybe one minor exception. We tend to forget this, but Barack Obama was drawing amazingly huge crowds in his run for the presidency. I remember one on television. It was in St. Louis. And as far as the eye could see, there were people coming to see Barack Obama. And that was the moment I said, you know, he's got a chance. I think he could win. I still thought the odds were against him, but that's when I thought it was at least a realistic possibility, was his electrifying ability. It was the same kind of thing, charisma that President Kennedy had. And Barack Obama energized the young people and just filled the streets and the plazas and the parks to as far as the eye could see. So I thought that was a sort of a turning point for me in how I viewed his candidacy. Looking back on it now, I think that was the high water mark of racial healing in our country and redemption in our country was 2008, maybe 2012, but his presidency. And it was a good time. It was a good time that we had that feeling of the racial divide has not gone away, but we are past it, and as not past it forever, but we've solved the problem. And he did really. He was a tremendous president. So that's the way I remember it at the time, and the way I look back on it now.
So I, on the other hand, thought he was going to win from almost the moment that I met him. I met him in 2004 when he was running in the primary for senator in Illinois, and thought he was fabulous. And I saw him at the convention, and from 2006 in December through 2008, I did as much as I could to help get him elected. And I always thought he was going to get elected because, like my father, I'm a very optimistic person, but also because he was so talented and strategic and smart about the way that he was running things. And I thought that his inauguration was one of the most joyous days I have never seen. When we flew back to Washington, and the plane was full of well-dressed African Americans who were going to celebrate this great day. And the day before the inauguration, people were just excited and proud and happy. And I thought, as Judge Henderson and Judge Alsup were saying, that this was a turning point in our country, that it marked the end of all the racial divide and hatred, and I was so wrong about that. But that's what I thought at the time, and I admire President Obama hugely, but the work continues.
Right, and it's wonderful to think back to that presidency, and it can be a little disheartening to think about the state of where we are right now. I want to turn the conversation to voting rights. So in 2020, we celebrated the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment and the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. In many ways, we've made significant progress since the ratification of those amendments. What are your views on the efforts that can be undertaken to continue to safeguard the promise of those amendments to give Black people and women access to the ballot?
What are the steps that ought to be taken? I think very simply, I think that we should safeguard those rights, 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment, in the same manner that we safeguard and protect the nation's gold bullion in Fort Knox. You know, really care about them and make sure no one gets in there and sneaks out a gold bar every now and then or raids the treasury. And no one's done it except in a James Bond movie when Goldfinger made a try at it. But I think, and partly what I'm saying and being a little sarcastic about it, is that I don't think we value those, and we let chipping away at the edges of it and diminishing it. And we have the capacity to make them as safe as the gold bullion. And I would like to see that happen.
Looking back on it, in that era when I was growing up in Mississippi, this was in the aftermath of World War II, and the simplistic way that me and a lot of other kids looked at World War II was that we had gone to war to protect democracy against fascism and dictatorship. And I was proud that I lived in a democracy. And as I got older, I came to learn that African Americans in Mississippi were not allowed to vote. I learned this as a young teenager. It wasn't like it took me 21 years. I learned this at least by the time I was 14 or 15. And I could not understand how we could, as a country, say we were a democracy unless everyone was given the right to vote and allowed to vote. So to me, in the, what's the word, the journey of going from one view to the other and or being won over to the right side of history, voting was the first thing that I focused on, that everyone should have the right to vote. Now, our audience is probably too young, but in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was hugely important because those amendments had been on the books. The 15th Amendment had been on the books 100 years, but had not been enforced. But the Voting Rights Act was the mechanism for enforcing it. It was a milestone, huge legislation in the history of the country. And again, the information that Judge Henderson helped develop there when he was a young lawyer in Louisiana, showing that pattern and practice of denying the right to vote, that all went before Congress and got that law through. Selma was a big thing too, the march of Selma to Montgomery. And President Johnson, and his ability to get something through Congress. That was an important step in protecting the right to vote. Now, the Supreme Court, though, undid that in a decision about, 7 or 8 years ago, part of the Voting Rights Act. In my own view, we ought to restore that. The legislation should be restored. And the one image that comes to mind that just as heartbreaking is in the very last election down in Georgia, in the November election, those long lines of African Americans standing out for half a mile, waiting for their turn to vote because of the systems that had been put in place to discourage it. Now, to their credit, they stood in line and voted anyway. And God bless them for that. But we should not tolerate that kind of burden on the right to vote. And so, to my mind, something that needs to be done is that Congress should restore the Voting Rights Act to its full strength in the next, I would say immediately, but there's the pandemic to deal with for now, but soon. That's my view. Thank you.
So to put legislative support around what you've just heard, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is in Congress, and it deals with some of the coercive measures that were necessary in order to keep people from denying the right to vote. And the For the People Act of 2021, which is HR 1, is a very comprehensive bill that deals with ensuring expanded access to the ballot box, which is key, reducing the influence of big money in politics, independent redistricting commissions, election integrity and security measures, campaign ethics fortification, all of those things. The bill is there to do what, and of course I wouldn't advocate for anything because I'm a sitting federal judge, but that those bills are there for Congress to act on in order to ensure that every American is able to vote and is encouraged to vote, because that's what a democracy is all about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we're getting some questions in from the audience, and so I wanted to ask a couple of those questions to the judges for any or all of you to address. So one of the questions says, we are now at a point in time where we are talking about explicit and implicit bias in the federal criminal justice system. Do you think the times are such that there can be fundamental changes in how we deal with crime, in particular mass incarceration in the federal system?
Yes, I think there can be. I'll jump on over Thelton, and just as Randy Sue Pollock was mentioning, I run an alternatives to incarceration program in the San Francisco division, along with Judge Corley, and we have them in each of our divisions, and those programs are able to keep people out of prison who have committed crimes and as a result of their addiction. And we have a very comprehensive program to work with them, and if they're able to succeed in that program, then they don't have to go to prison. And it's been a very successful program. Over 70% of people have been graduating from that. It would be great and easy to expand that. In addition, there are a sentencing commission that was that had members on it. I think Judge Breyer might be the only one, or there's one Republican on it right now, but could be acting to reduce the guidelines with respect to some nonviolent crimes, drug-related, and there's a lot that we could do to focus incarceration only on people who needed to be incarceration, and then ensuring that people who were in prison had the ability to do programs, and so that when they came out, they wouldn't recidivate. So yes.
Yeah,
I agree with what Judge Orrick said. I could add to it a little bit, but let me just say I subscribe to everything that he just said.
I do too, and I've worked on some of those programs, not at the court, because you guys sort of started that about the time I was leaving the court, but I worked in a program in Alameda County that Judge Henry Ramsey had started, and used to go over there once a week and actually serve. I got sworn in by the chief judge of that court as a state court judge for that court. And it was a wonderfully fulfilling experience for me. And a story I like to tell about it, and you guys know me well enough, I love to tell my little stories. But a story from that was that one night I was visiting a young friend who was a graduate student, lived in West Oakland, sort of a tough part of town. And I went up, honked my horn for her to come out. We were going to go to dinner, and I was blocking the sidewalk. And as I was waiting and listening to some music, I saw somebody looking in my car window, kind of a tough looking guy. And I said, "Whoops, I'm blocking the driveway, let me go." And he banged on the window and said, "Are you Judge Henderson?" And I wasn't sure if I should say yes or not, but I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Wait right here." And he ran down the street, and he came back with his parents. And he had turned out to be one of the people that had gone through that court. And he had successfully completed the court. And part of the court thing was to help them get a job or an education, whatever the program determined. And he was doing well. And we just stood there proud of him. And I got to meet the parents. And that was just one I met. But knowing things like that are happening in these programs is just as satisfying, just as satisfactory as anything I can think of that I've done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we're getting a number of questions that really hit at an interest in folks hearing your thoughts on the backslide that we've seen in some of the gains made during the civil rights movement. And the gist of a number of these questions is, why was Obama's presidency not the turning point that we that many of us believed that it would be. And so I wonder if you can respond to that question, and also sort of a different but perhaps related topic, which is to speak a little bit about your views on the shootings of Black people that we've seen in recent years by police officers, and thoughts about how we can reach a solution for this problem. So two separate questions, but just given that we're running short on time, we'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on either or both of them.
So I'll take the first question, and I know Bill has some thoughts about the second one, but my thinking is, with respect to President Obama's presidency, race is an intractable problem, and it is the original sin in our country, and it is just, we didn't realize how deeply racist parts of our society were. And in some ways, it's so much better at this point to have it out in the open, and have people recognizing the systemic racism that is so clear in the pandemic, and in the insurrection, and everything else, so that we can actually come to grips with it. And it's my hope that we never really grappled with it with President Obama. We just thought that he was magic, and that was solving the problem. But what we have to do is we have to understand our history first, and basically have truth and reconciliation in the way that Nelson Mandela and Bishop Tutu were able to bring it in South Africa. And then understanding that, move forward with solutions. So that's my answer. So I'll kick it to you, Bill.
On the second question, I think the number is 135 Black Americans have been killed, not just hurt, but killed by white police officers since 2015. That's an amazing number, 135 in 5 years. And it is worse than 20 years ago. It's worse than 10 years ago. I can't say it's worse than in the civil rights era, but it is an upswing. Uptick would be too mild a word. And it's alarming that has been occurring in our country. When I think about the problem and try to analyze it, I think there are two causes. One is racism. One is lack of training. In my home state of Mississippi, for example, there have been 5 instances in the last 5 years that they're not well publicized, but I have been following it. In some of those cases, the officers were African American themselves. And I don't think they did it out of racism. I think they did it out of poor training. This leads to what I think is something we should look at, federal funding. The police all over the country depend on federal funding. And the federal government, I believe, has it within its power to put strings on those federal funds. And some of those strings ought to be to outlaw the use of the pressing the knee against somebody's neck. It's just like the chokehold was so bad. This ought to be outlawed. Maybe in a case of somebody who threatened an officer with an actual gun, maybe that could be an exception, but it would be okay with me if we just outlawed it altogether. We should also have training in de-escalation techniques so that, in my view, looking at these cases, the officers go for the gun too soon. And I believe they are being taught in these schools that if they think there is a gun or a knife, they can shoot immediately. And that is wrong. In my view, that should not be, there should be an actual imminent threat of use by the person of the gun before you start shooting at them. Another thing that we need is those cameras. Body cameras should always be on. The dashboard cameras should always be on. I've had cases as a judge where those cameras were exceedingly valuable to see what really happened. And sometimes, in fact, I would say probably most times, 60% of the time, it helps the police because it shows what happened. It's a very good chronicle of what actually happened. The police ought to be in favor of the body cameras, but for some reason they tend to resist it. Another thing that needs to be done is when someone is killed, the family should be allowed by the police to get the information as to what happened, instead of having to hire a lawyer and go to court to get it. I see that in my own cases. I won't name who the counties are, but I see it that somebody has to hire a lawyer to go and force the county to turn over the information on what happened in the death of their loved one. So there should be it's kind of like a victim's bill of rights, and the family is the victim. They should be allowed to learn how their loved one died and to have access to all of that information. Now, some of that the Trump administration actually started down the path of enacting by executive order, not all of it, but that was a step in the right direction. And I think we should do more. We should do more, and we should maybe we need federal legislation to give authority to the Justice Department to put those kinds of strings. To my mind, that is the quickest way to a good elimination of these abusive police tactics. So enough on that. Thelton, your turn.
Okay, I'll pick up on that thread, Bill. And I've been working on a project with Judge Joseph Groden and some others on police reform. And we believe there are many areas that need reformation, but we've been focusing on collective bargaining and changing some of the rules, because my 17 years actually of experience with the Oakland Police Department, one of the things that one of my takeaways from that is that there's no accountability for the policeman. And I just told this story the other night. On last December 26th, I got a call in the morning from a friend asking me if I knew how to get in touch with John Burris. For the audience, he's a very successful, very well-known lawyer whose specialty is suing the police for excessive force and other improper acts by the police. The reason my friend wanted it was that his family to which he's friends had just had their son killed by a policeman in Antioch. The kid had had emotional problems, and the family called the police for help. He wasn't violent, but they couldn't control him, and they thought the police might help. When the police got there, there were two policemen. Mom was actually sitting on the bed with the son in her arms, comforting him. The police immediately came in, took him from her arms, threw him face down on the floor, and put his knee on his neck, shades of George Floyd. And there was absolutely no need for it. And that goes to your point, Bill, of training. There's no need for that. And it ended up killing the young man. The reason I talk about accountability is that I know right now under the present structure and the way the Police Bill of Rights acts, that nothing will happen to these cops, not even financially. John Burris will win another suit, or he'll settle another suit. He'll make a big award for the family. He'll get a big award for himself. And the policeman won't pay a dollar. The taxpayers will pay it. The city of Antioch will pay it. I've even had cases where the jury has awarded punitive damages to a policeman and the city pays for that. So the whole structure of the police rights are one-sided now. I certainly believe in unions, but the police unions are so one-sided now, I believe, and they have so many protections. And one that you mentioned, Bill, this was December 26th when this happened. They still have not seen an autopsy. They haven't seen any of the film. The police have created their own story, and things shouldn't happen like this. I don't believe that police should be defunded, but I think maybe refunding, just to answer this problem, training. Maybe policemen ought not answer that 911 call there, that some specialists specialists in handling mental health problems either ought to go with the police or instead of the police. And the same thing probably for domestic violence cases. It needs a touch other than someone who's trained to handle violent people and assert their authority and their weapon advantage. And the whole thing needs to be restructured. And Laura, you mentioned implicit bias. And I think, Bill, when you were talking about drawing when you think there's a weapon there, it's just clear to me that in the implicit bias at work, that a black is just seen as someone a bigger threat than a white sitting in a car as you approach that car, or sitting in the house as you approach that house. And there needs to be training that really takes hold and changes that. So those are just some random thoughts. I think a lot about it. I perhaps think too much about it. But Ed, I agree with everything that Judge Orrick and Judge Alsup said, and some additional thoughts there that I've just given you.
Well, I appreciate the willingness of each of you to speak about these topics, some of which are difficult and challenges that we currently face. And I know we're a little bit over, but if the judges, each of you will indulge, I wanted to end on an optimistic note. And so I wonder if each of you can just briefly tell us, in light of all of this, what keeps the hope alive with you?
Well, for me, despite what I just said, sometimes it's hard to be hopeful and optimistic, but I remain so. And I think it's all that I've seen with all the great and brave men and women who've come before me, who've inspired me, who've given of themselves, who's given their lives to get us to the brink of equality with the election of Obama and things that have happened in recent years. When I look back at what I saw down south in 62 and 63, and look at where we are now, when I look at my own career and think that in law school, if I had told my classmates, I think I'd like to be a federal judge someday, they would have laughed or put me in a straitjacket because there had never been a federal judge, and now I are one, as they say. When I see all of these things, I'm optimistic. And when I think of the people who have led the way so bravely and gotten us so far, I think be just some sort of betrayal for me to give up at this point. I think no choice but to hope that we will carry on, and I do think we will. Dr. King said at one point that he saw the march toward justice as 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. And I think that's so. We are making progress. There's absolutely no question about it. I think right now we've taken a fairly giant step backward, but I'm optimistic that we'll repeat. We'll have time for 2 steps forward, and we will continue with progress.
Judge Henderson said it better than I could, so I will simply add this to what he just said, with which I totally agree, and it reflects my own sentiments. And that is a message to all the young lawyers who are listening. And that is, your profession is the only profession, private profession, where you take an oath to support the Constitution. Doctors don't do that. No other private profession does that. You have an important responsibility in that regard. And as you go forward, the day will come when you will be in a position to have a choice to make as to something good that you could do for your country. And when you are confronted with that, I hope you do the right thing. Thank you.
And I'll just add, I do believe that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. The abolitionist Theodore Parker said that. Dr. King used to say it all the time. I totally believe it. In 1984, when I left Georgia, I sat with the federal judge who I'd been bringing all of my cases in front of. And he sat me down for about 45 minutes, and he told me the story of his life, a relatively privileged white Southerner growing up in Statesboro, Georgia. And he described everything that had happened, growing up in segregation. And he was a lawyer for the Statesboro schools as it was desegregating. And he said, you know, Bill, you seem like you're in a hurry to get a lot of things done. But let me tell you how far things have come so far. It gave me an appreciation of really the reality of social change and how it happens. And sitting there in 1984, would I have ever thought that an African American would be elected to the Senate in Georgia? Not a chance. And you look at the protests after George Floyd, the advance that were so diverse, the advancement that we've seen so quickly with the LGBTQ community. I think there's everything to be optimistic and hopeful for, but it requires all of us to be doing this hard and important work.
Thank you all. If we were in an auditorium, there would be a thunderous round of applause for everything that you've shared with us so generously. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, judges, for your participation, and Laura for moderating. I'd like to encourage you all to join FBA to enjoy programs that we put on, such as this one. So thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you all at the March 7th program. Bye-bye.